Story 1. The locked door at the end of the hall. When I moved into the apartment, the landlord seemed normal enough. Normal for someone renting out what was basically a glorified broom closet. The building was old, with water-stained walls and a smell that reminded me of wet carpet. I wasn't expecting much for $400 a month. He handed me the key and rattled off the usual spiel about utilities and garbage pickup. Then, just as I turned to leave, he leaned in close, too close, and said, "One more thing. Don't open the door at the end of the hall. Ever." I laughed, assuming it was some kind of weird joke, but his face didn't move. "I'm serious," he said. "Don't even go near it." I nodded and hurried off, hoping the odd exchange would just be the first of many quirky city living anecdotes I could laugh about later. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. The hallway was dimly lit, with peeling wallpaper and flickering light bulbs straight out of a horror movie. The infamous door stood at the very end, black and scuffed, with a rusted doorknob that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I told myself I wouldn't think about it. I had enough to deal with. Unpacking, starting my new job, trying to get the ancient radiator in my unit to work. But it was impossible not to notice. The neighbors didn't help. There were only a handful of us in the building, and none of them seemed interested in making small talk. When I tried introducing myself to the guy across the hall, he barely mumbled a hello before slamming his door shut. The older woman in the unit next to mine just stared at me, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line. It didn't take long to figure out the unspoken rule of the building. Nobody mentioned the door, but I could feel their eyes on me every time I passed it, like they were waiting for me to break some kind of unspoken code. The first night I heard it, I thought I was imagining things. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint tap, tap, tap coming from the hallway. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just the old pipes, or maybe one of my neighbors moving around. But then it happened again. This time, it was louder. I tiptoed to my front door and pressed my ear against it. The tapping was coming from the direction of the black door. My heart thudded in my chest. I wanted to open my door just to look, but something about the sound kept me rooted in place. It wasn't just tapping, it was deliberate, rhythmic. Top, top, top. A pause. Then, top, top, top. The sound stopped abruptly, and I jumped back, half expecting someone, or something, to knock on my door next. But the hall stayed silent, and eventually, I forced myself back to bed. The next morning, I asked the woman next door if she'd heard anything during the night. Her face went pale, and she shook her head without meeting my eyes. "Best to mind your own business," she muttered before slamming her door shut. The days passed, and the noises got worse. Sometimes it was tapping. Other times, it sounded like scratching, nails dragging against wood. Once, I swore I heard crying, soft and muffled, like someone trying not to be heard. I started avoiding my apartment as much as possible. I stayed late at work, took the long way home, and even hung out at the 24-hour diner down the street just to avoid going back. But no matter how late I stayed out, the noises always started up as soon as I stepped inside. One night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. "Help me." The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but it was definitely there. A woman's voice, pleading. I grabbed a chair and pressed my eye to the peephole, but the hallway was empty. The black door was just sitting there, as still and lifeless as ever. I wanted to call the police, but what would I say? "Hi, there's a creepy door in my building, and I think it's making noises?" I'd sound insane. But then came the pounding. It was around 2 a.m., and I was jolted awake by the sound of someone slamming against the door. I shot out of bed, my pulse racing. The pounding was relentless, shaking the walls. I crept to my front door, heart in my throat, and looked out the peephole again. Still nothing. But the pounding continued, now accompanied by muffled screams. "Please, help me. Let me out." I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity, or maybe my stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed my phone, unlocked my door, and stepped into the hallway. The black door was trembling with each bang. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. "Don't do it," a voice said behind me. I spun around to see the old woman standing in her doorway, her face twisted in fear. "Leave it alone," she hissed. "You don't want to know what's in there." But I couldn't stop myself. Something about the door felt magnetic, like it was pulling me in. I turned the knob, and the door creaked open. The room inside was pristine, cleaner than anything else in the building. White walls, white carpet, and shelves lined with objects that made my stomach drop. Photos. Hundreds of them. All of me. There were pictures of me walking to work, eating dinner in my apartment, even sleeping. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. On the floor was a journal, its pages filled with detailed notes about my daily routine. What I ate, where I went, who I spoke to. Flipping through, I found entries dating back years. Someone had been watching me long before I'd moved in. A shadow fell across the doorway. I looked up to see the landlord standing there, a knife in his hand. "I told you not to open the door," he said, his voice calm. I didn't think. I just acted. Grabbing a heavy camera from one of the shelves, I swung it at him, catching him across the face. He stumbled back, and I ran. I burst into the hallway, my legs trembling. But as soon as I turned the corner, I stopped dead. The neighbors were waiting for me, their faces blank, their eyes cold. The old woman stepped forward, her lips curling into a thin smile. "Didn't I tell you?" she said softly. Before I could react, they grabbed me. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but there were too many of them. They dragged me back to the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The last thing I saw was the landlord raising a camera, the flash blinding me. I don't know if anyone will read this, but if you do, stay away from 1378 Pine Street. The door is locked again, and now, I think I'm the one they're watching. Story 2. The stranger who knew my name. It started with the man in the cafe window. I was on my lunch break, sitting at my usual spot by the window, scrolling mindlessly through my phone while pretending to care about my cold sandwich. Across the street, a man was sitting by the window of the cafe opposite mine. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another face in the crowd. But then I noticed something strange. He wasn't looking at his phone, or reading a book, or doing anything normal for someone sitting in a cafe. He was looking at me. I stared back for a moment, waiting for him to look away like any normal person would when caught staring. But he didn't. He just sat there, sipping his coffee, eyes locked on me. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off. People are weird sometimes. Maybe he thought I looked familiar. Maybe I had food on my face. Whatever. I packed up my lunch and went back to work. I didn't think about him again until later that evening. I was walking home, cutting through the park like I always do, when I saw him again. He was sitting on a bench, still staring at me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. Was it a coincidence? Maybe he lived nearby, and we just happened to take the same route. But as I walked past, he smiled. "Hey, Birdie," he said, his voice light and friendly. I stopped dead in my tracks. Birdie. No one had called me that in 20 years. It was a nickname from my childhood, something my dad used to call me because I loved birds. After he died, the name went with him. No one else had ever used it. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice shaking. The man tilted his head, his smile widening. "You don't remember me?" I shook my head. "Don't worry," he said. "You will." And with that, he stood up and walked away, leaving me frozen in the middle of the path. I should have gone to the police right then and there. But what could I tell them? A man I didn't know called me by an old nickname? It wasn't exactly a crime. The next day, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just some weirdo who overheard someone calling me Birdie a long time ago. Maybe it was just a lucky guess. But the man didn't go away. I saw him again the next morning. He was standing outside my office building, leaning against the wall, pretending to scroll through his phone. He looked up as I approached, gave me a small wave, and then walked off before I could confront him. Later, he showed up at the grocery store while I was picking out vegetables. He didn't say anything this time, just smiled as he walked past me, his cart empty. By the third day, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I caught him waiting outside my apartment building that evening. My hands were shaking as I approached him, my bag clutched tightly to my chest. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice trembling. The man raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Birdie. I'm just a friend." "I don't know you," I snapped. He smiled that same unnerving smile. "Sure you do. We go way back. You just don't remember." My head was spinning. I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers. But he was so calm, so casual. like he genuinely believed what he was saying. Before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words in my head, trying to remember if I'd seen him before, but his face didn't ring any bells. The next morning, I found a letter on the windshield of my car. The envelope had my name written on it in neat, precise handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a short message. "You owe me." My blood ran cold. I called the police this time, but they weren't much help. They told me to file a report, but without any concrete evidence or threats, there wasn't much they could do. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started finding things in my apartment that didn't belong to me. An old photograph of my elementary school, a toy bird that looked eerily like one I'd had as a child. Once, I came home to find my kitchen light on, even though I was sure I'd turned it off before leaving. The breaking point came when I found the surveillance photos. They were in a manila envelope taped to my front door. Inside were dozens of pictures of me, walking to work, sitting in the cafe, sleeping in my own bed. I stared at the photos, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold them. He'd been in my apartment. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I finally passed out from exhaustion. I woke up to the sound of breathing. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I felt a warm, steady breath against my cheek. I opened my eyes and screamed. The man was standing over me, his face inches from mine. He smiled, his teeth gleaming in the darkness. "Shoo," he whispered, pressing a finger to my lips. "Don't scream, Birdie. I'm not going to hurt you." I tried to move, but he was too fast. He grabbed my wrists and held them down, his grip like iron. "You don't remember me," he said, his voice soft, almost sad. "But I remember you. I remember everything." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, holding it up to my face. It was a picture of two kids, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting on a swing set. One of them was me. The other was him. In the photo, we were laughing together, but something about the picture was off. I wasn't laughing. Not really. My smile was forced, my eyes wide and terrified. And in my hand, I was holding a knife. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against my ear. "You took everything from me," he whispered. "Now I'm going to take it back." The last thing I saw before he pressed the blade to my throat was his smile. This post is the only way I can warn people. He's still out there. If someone starts calling you by a name you haven't heard in years, run. Don't wait for them to remind you why you forgot. Story 3. The Babysitter's Nightmare. When I took the babysitting gig for Timmy, it seemed like the easiest $100 I'd ever make. His parents were headed to some swanky gala, and all they needed was someone to keep an eye on their 8-year-old until they got home around midnight. I could practically feel the money in my pocket as I smiled and nodded during their rushed instructions. Bedtime is 8:30, no sweets after dinner. And oh, Timmy likes to play pranks. "Pranks?" I repeated, amused. "Yeah, he has a big imagination," Mrs. Lark said, giving her husband a nervous glance. "If he says anything odd, just ignore it. He'll try to scare you, but it's harmless." "Got it," I said, waving them off. "I'll be fine." Looking back, I wish I'd pressed her on what she meant by odd. Timmy was polite enough when they left, if a little quiet. He sat at the kitchen table eating his macaroni and cheese while I scrolled through my phone, making occasional small talk. "What's your favorite subject in school?" I asked. "Math," he mumbled, pushing the noodles around his plate. "Cool. I hate math." He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked up at me with those wide, dark eyes of his and said, "Do you believe in monsters?" I paused, unsure how to answer. "Not really." "Why? Do you?" He nodded solemnly. "There's one in my closet." I bit back a laugh, remembering his mom's warning. "Oh yeah? What does it look like?" Timmy tilted his head, considering. "It changes. Sometimes it looks like a man. Sometimes it's a shadow. But it's always smiling." Okay, so the kid was creepy. I chalked it up to an overactive imagination and steered the conversation back to lighter topics. After dinner, we watched some cartoons until bedtime. Timmy didn't fight me on brushing his teeth or putting on pajamas, which was a nice change from the screaming tantrums I dealt with during past babysitting jobs. By 8:30, he was tucked in, and I was ready to coast through the rest of the evening with Netflix and snacks. As I turned off his bedroom light, Timmy grabbed my hand. "Don't let it out," he whispered. I frowned. "What?" "The monster," he said, nodding toward his closet. "If it comes out, it'll get mad." I forced a smile, gently pulling my hand away. "Go to sleep, Timmy." But his words stuck with me as I settled onto the couch. Something about the way he said them, the seriousness in his voice, gave me goosebumps. The house was silent for a while, save for the faint hum of the fridge. I just started to relax when I heard a creak from upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling, but then it came again, louder this time. I muted the TV, straining to hear. Thud. It sounded like something falling to the floor. "Timmy," I called, standing up. No answer. I grabbed my phone and headed upstairs, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. His bedroom door was slightly ajar, and when I peeked in, I saw him sitting up in bed, facing the closet. "Timmy, are you okay?" He didn't look at me. He was whispering something, his voice too low for me to make out the words. "Timmy," I said more firmly, stepping into the room. He jumped, turning to me with wide eyes. "You scared it," he said, his voice trembling. "Scared what?" He pointed to the closet. "Okay, buddy, this isn't funny anymore," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Go back to sleep." But Timmy just shook his head. "It doesn't like you." I sighed, rubbing my temples. Clearly, this kid needed to lay off the scary movies. "Look, there's no monster, okay? I'll prove it." I marched over to the closet, yanked open the door, and nothing, just rows of neatly hung clothes and a pile of stuffed animals on the floor. "See," I said, turning back to him. "No monster." Timmy didn't look convinced. His eyes were fixed on the back wall of the closet, his little face pale. "What's that?" he whispered. I turned back, frowning. At first, I didn't see what he was talking about, but then I noticed it, a faint outline in the wood, barely visible in the dim light. A hidden compartment. I hesitated. "Don't," Timmy said, his voice rising in panic. "Don't open it." But curiosity got the better of me. I slid the panel aside, revealing a small, dark space behind it. Inside were several old toys, wooden blocks, a toy truck, a doll with matted hair. They were covered in thick, dark stains. Blood. I stumbled back, my heart racing. "What the hell?" Timmy started crying, pulling the blanket over his head. "You made it mad," he sobbed. Suddenly, the closet door slammed shut on its own. I screamed, grabbing Timmy and pulling him out of bed. "We're leaving," I said, dragging him toward the door. But just as we reached the hallway, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. "Timmy," I shouted, but he pulled away from me, running back into his room. I chased after him, fumbling in the dark. When I reached the doorway, I saw him standing in front of the closet, whispering again. "What are you doing?" I cried. "It says it'll go away if you leave," he said, his voice eerily calm. "No," I said, grabbing his arm. "We're leaving together." But as I pulled him toward the stairs, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the closet. I didn't wait to see what it was. I carried Timmy down the stairs, grabbed my bag, and bolted out the door. The Larks came home an hour later to find me sitting on their front porch, clutching Timmy and shaking like a leaf. "What happened?" Mrs. Lark asked, her face pale. "There's something in his closet," I said, my voice trembling. "Something wrong?" They exchanged a look, and Mr. Lark sighed. "We thought we fixed it," he muttered. "Fixed what?" I demanded. Mrs. Lark hesitated. "Timmy had an imaginary friend when he was younger," she said carefully. "It told him to do bad things. We thought it was just a phase, but then," she trailed off, looking at her husband. "We took care of it," he finished. I stared at them in disbelief. "You knew? You knew? And you didn't warn me?" "It hasn't done anything in years," Mrs. Lark said defensively. "We thought it was gone." Before I could respond, I heard a noise behind me. I turned to see Timmy standing at the top of the stairs, watching us. In his hand, he held a knife. "Timmy," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled a wide, unnatural grin. "It says you should have listened." I don't know what's wrong with Timmy, but if you ever babysit for the Larks, don't ignore the closet. Story 4. The Forgotten Camper. I've always loved hiking. Something about the woods feels like a reset button. No cell service, no people, just the quiet hum of nature. That's why, on a crisp autumn weekend, I found myself trekking deep into a state park I'd never been to before. I'd heard it was remote, peaceful, and practically untouched. Perfect for a little solitude. About 3 hours into my hike, I stumbled across something strange. It was half buried under a thick layer of leaves at the base of a tree, a tattered leather-bound journal. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched down to pick it up. The cover was scratched and water-damaged, but the pages inside were mostly intact. The handwriting was neat, almost meticulous, like the author had taken their time with every word. The first few entries were unremarkable, typical camping stuff. Set up camp near the stream. Weather looks good. Saw a deer while gathering firewood. Harmless observations. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone started to shift. I thought I saw someone watching me from the tree line. Probably just my imagination. The next entry was even stranger. I heard footsteps circling my tent last night. When I checked, no one was there. Starting to feel uneasy. By the time I got to the last few pages, my heart was pounding. The entries were frantic, the neat handwriting devolving into shaky scrawls. Something is out here with me. I see it watching from the trees, but when I look directly at it, it's gone. It's not an animal. It's not a person. It's something else. The final entry chilled me to my core. It's inside my tea. That was it. The sentence stopped abruptly, the pen trailing off the page like the writer had been interrupted. I looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. The trees seemed taller, the shadows deeper. My rational brain told me it was just a creepy story, someone trying to scare whoever found the journal. But another part of me, the part that couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, wasn't so sure. Against my better judgment, I decided to camp in the same area. I don't know what possessed me to do it. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared, that the journal was just someone's idea of a joke. Or maybe I was just an idiot. I found a small clearing near a stream and set up my tent. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting the forest in long, golden shadows. As I unrolled my sleeping bag, I glanced at the journal sitting on a rock outside my tent. I wasn't sure why I'd brought it with me, but something about it felt like it belonged here, like it was part of the place. The first few hours were uneventful. I made a small fire, cooked some instant noodles, and listened to the sounds of the forest. Crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze. It was almost peaceful. Until it wasn't. Around midnight, the noises started. It began with a soft snapping sound, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, straining to hear. Another snap. Closer this time, I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees, but the beam illuminated nothing but empty woods. "Hello," I called, my voice trembling. No response. I climbed back into my tent, zipping it up tightly and telling myself it was just an animal. Probably a deer. Nothing to worry about. But then I heard the murmurs. Low, guttural voices, too faint to make out any words. They seemed to come from all around me, circling the tent. "Hello," I called again, louder this time. The murmurs stopped. I held my breath, waiting, but the only sound was the frantic thudding of my own heart. After what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The journal had spooked me, that's all. I lay back down, trying to ignore the cold dread settling in my stomach. That's when I noticed the journal. It was inside my tent. I stared at it, my mind racing. I knew I'd left it outside. I'd seen it sitting on the rock before I zipped the tent shut. But now it was here, lying open on the floor. With shaking hands, I picked it up. The page it was open to wasn't one I'd seen before. It wasn't one of the original entries. It was new. One word scrawled in large, uneven letters. "Welcome." I dropped the journal and scrambled out of the tent, my flashlight shaking in my grip. I didn't care about my gear or the fire. I just needed to get out. I ran blindly into the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees loomed around me, their branches clawing at my clothes. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. Behind me, I heard it. Footsteps. Fast, heavy, and getting closer. I ran harder, my lungs burning, my legs threatening to give out. But no matter how far I went, the footsteps stayed right behind me. Eventually, I collapsed, my body refusing to go any farther. I lay there, gasping for air, waiting for the footsteps to reach me. But they didn't. When I finally dared to look around, I realized I was back at the campsite. My tent was there, zipped up neatly, the fire still smoldering. It was like I'd never left. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." I stumbled toward the tent, desperate for some kind of explanation. My hands trembled as I unzipped it and looked inside. The journal was lying on top of my sleeping bag. I opened it, my stomach twisting with dread. The entries were different now. They weren't written in the neat, careful handwriting I'd seen before. They were in mine. Every page detailed what I'd done that night, setting up camp, hearing the noises, running into the woods. The final entry made my blood run cold. It's inside my tent. If you ever find a journal in the woods, leave it alone. I don't know how long I've been out here, but I can't leave. Every time I try, I end up back at the same spot. It's watching me, and if you read this, it'll watch you too. Story 5. The Midnight Delivery. Being a food delivery driver isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. I've seen some weird things on my late-night shifts. Drunk customers answering the door in their underwear. People who forget they ordered food. One guy who paid me entirely in quarters. But nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what happened last Tuesday night. It started like any other shift. I was parked in the usual lot, scrolling through my phone, waiting for an order to pop up. At around 11:30 p.m., I got a request: a double cheeseburger, fries, and a milkshake from a diner on the edge of town. The address listed wasn't familiar, but that wasn't surprising. I'd only been delivering in this area for a few months, and some of the back roads weren't on my radar yet. The pay for the order was decent, so I accepted it without thinking twice. The food was ready when I got to the diner, the staff bagging it up with their usual half-asleep expressions. I typed the address into my GPS, but it immediately told me no results found. I tried again, double-checking the spelling. Same thing. That should have been my first red flag. Instead of canceling, I pulled up a map and manually searched for the street. After a few minutes, I found it, or at least I found what looked like a dirt path branching off a rural highway. It wasn't marked, and the map didn't show any houses in the area, but I figured it was worth a shot. The drive out was eerie. The highway was deserted, the only light coming from my high beams and the occasional flicker of a roadside lamp. After about 20 minutes, I spotted the turnoff. It was just a narrow, overgrown path leading into the woods, barely wide enough for my car. Every instinct I had was telling me to turn back. But I'd already driven this far, and the app would dock my ratings if I bailed. So, like an idiot, I made the turn. The deeper I drove, the darker it got. The trees were so dense that my headlights barely penetrated the shadows. The dirt road was uneven, bouncing my car with every pothole. After what felt like forever, I saw it, a house if you could even call it that. It was old and dilapidated, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving the wood beneath exposed and rotting. The windows were boarded up, and the front porch sagged like it might collapse at any moment. There were no lights on, no sign of anyone inside. I hesitated, gripping the wheel. This couldn't be the right place. Maybe the customer had entered the address wrong. Maybe this was some prank to freak out delivery drivers. But then my phone buzzed. It was a text from the app's chat feature. "Leave it on the porch." That was all it said. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Something about the message felt off, like whoever sent it knew exactly what I was thinking. I grabbed the bag and stepped out of the car, my breath visible in the chilly night air. The woods were silent, unnervingly so. No crickets, no wind, nothing. As I climbed the creaking porch steps, I kept telling myself I'd just leave the food and get out of there. No knocking, no waiting for a tip. Just drop it and go. I set the bag down by the door, turned to leave, and froze. "Aren't you going to stay for dinner?" The voice was deep, smooth, and far too close. I turned back, and my heart nearly stopped. A man was standing in the doorway, his face half hidden in the shadows. He was tall and thin, wearing a suit that looked decades out of style. But it wasn't his clothes that unsettled me. It was his smile. His teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too white, and far too many of them. "I am just a delivery driver," I stammered, backing away. "The food's on the porch." "That's it." The man stepped forward, his movements unnervingly smooth, like he was gliding. "But you've come all this way," he said. "The least you can do is come inside. We wouldn't want to be rude, would we?" I shook my head, my throat dry. "I really have to go. Enjoy your meal." I turned and practically sprinted to my car, slamming the door shut and fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get the ignition to turn. The engine sputtered but wouldn't start. Come on, I muttered, trying again. Nothing. The battery wasn't dead. I could still hear the radio, faintly humming, but the car refused to start. That's when I saw him. The man was standing just outside the driver's side window, his face pressed so close to the glass I could see every line of his too wide grin. "Going somewhere?" he asked, tilting his head. I screamed, throwing open the passenger door and scrambling out. I ran blindly into the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. I just kept running, convinced that if I looked back, I'd see him right behind me. Eventually, my legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground. I lay there, panting, listening for any sign of pursuit. Nothing. Just silence. I didn't realize I'd passed out until I woke up. The sun was rising, casting an eerie orange glow over the forest. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then I noticed the blood. It was all over me, my hands, my clothes, even my face. My stomach turned as I sat up, trying to piece together what had happened. That's when I saw it. The delivery bag. It was sitting a few feet away, untouched. The food inside was still neatly wrapped, exactly how I'd left it. I don't remember how I found my way back to the road, but when I finally flagged down a passing car, I must have looked like a lunatic. The driver offered to call the police, but I told them not to bother. What could I say? That I'd been attacked by a man with too many teeth who somehow knew my car wouldn't start? That I'd woken up covered in blood with no memory of how it got there? No one would believe me. I quit the delivery app that same day. If you ever get a delivery request to a place that doesn't show up on a map, don't take it. I don't know what I ran from that night, but I don't think it was human. And something tells me it's still hungry. Thanks for watching. If you like the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.